but little do we know that open source and FOSS is not just about coding, but
Okay.
more than
Hello,
about
check,
philosophy
check,
you carry, which eventually
check, check.
shapes your career. So today, Rahul is here to embark on the trip down the memory lane and to see how open source played a key role shaping in his growth across the 2 decades, spanning Google, startup, and then in the impact sector, building population scale, open source, and mentoring youngsters. Let's strive in this FOSS world to learn more about different flavors of open source builders, contributors, licenses, business models, and yeah, a lot more. So let's give it up for Rahul Kulkarni, and he'll be guiding you through the FOSS life.
Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone. How many of you are students? Alright, wonderful. And so since most of you are students, we've seen some wonderful talks since morning, especially the last two. Really fascinating to see those journeys, right? How do you get started, what happens? But always the first challenge is, what's the project that you start with? The question in your mind always is, you have a range of ideas, right? One range, like Rohan said earlier in the morning, was, can you solve climate change? Like, but अरे मैं code क्या लिखूं to solve climate change, right? That must be a question in your mind. Then on the other front, I think Faika broke it down very nicely to say, you start with documentation. You start with simple things that you can actually contribute. But the intensity needs to be very high. The depth, the quality needs to be very high. I hope everyone has read about the Express.js fiasco, right? Everyone's sending horrible PRs. Please, that's just a travesty of open source. You need depth in anything you do. So even if your project, right? Even if your project is something as simple as, let's create a calculator. Let's just create a calculator. Now, how do you do it? You would have a back-end, front-end. Okay? You can either do everything in the front end. It could be just one HTML page with some JavaScript. Yeah, you could use HTMX and just do it within tags itself and be done with it. Then you say, okay, let's make it more complicated. Let's add JavaScript to it. Then you say, let's make it even more complicated. Let's add Node.js to it. Okay, Node.js on the back end, and let me expose an API. What would your API look like? You'll have /add, /subtract, /divide, /multiply, and then you put it out there. Then if some contributor wants to come and say, yaar, मेरे को matrix division करना है, matrix multiplication करना है. Now what? That person would have to add another API call. Yeah? Is that a good design? Have you ever used Sublime? Yeah, how many of you have seen Sublime? Or even VS Code? How many of you have used VS Code? Okay, great. So in VS Code you have those plugins, na? So Markdown को देखना है तो you add a plugin. कुछ भी देखना है you add a plugin. Third parties have made it. So how do you make this calculator program contributable? So how do you create a plugin type architecture behind? Suddenly you're getting into the depths of it. You're learning how to write an API, how to write plugins, how to architect that well. Then you can even get into further depth. Like, I forget the name, but someone talked about really well about open telemetry. How do you know performance of that calculator? How long is it taking to add two numbers? And if you take 1 second, so when you start creating thousands of things, you want to render videos, images and all of that is going to eat up time. So you need split second, split millisecond kind of interval performance. So how do you measure performance? What kind of tests do you run for performance? Now you get into DevOps. Remember, we're still creating a calculator. And so कोई project छोटा बड़ा नहीं होता. But you have to really excel, make that the best in class, world class project in whatever you do. So today what I'm going to do is try to give you some anecdotes of how do you choose projects. Now what you take away, what does it mean to choose projects? Not in a very prescriptive way, but in a way that is more in terms of how are the decisions that you make, what are the parameters that you look at when taking projects. In fact, you would know the biggest thing that you can do well is to say no to projects. there are so many things to be done. Saying no is the biggest challenge. What to say no to is shaped by your philosophy. And so what I want to go through is go down a bunch of decisions that I made, that I encountered, that I learned from, that helped shape my worldview of what FOSS means, what kind of projects I like. Okay, so we're going to do three things. I want to really communicate three things to you today. One is, what is that FOSS philosophy? How have I internalized it? You would have your own journey. But I'll give you some anecdotes of where this is coming from, what are the different parts that I learned. Other part is, how important people are in this whole journey. And lastly, I want to touch on this whole thing of how do you get into jigsaw puzzles. Life is a jigsaw puzzle, yes. Code is also a jigsaw puzzle. And how many of you on Code Chef trying to get to 2-star, 3-star, 4-star? Not too many, huh? That's good. Okay, वो बीमारी नहीं लगी है. You still need to do Code Chef, by the way. एक interview रहता है data structures का. Okay, you can't escape that. But there is also a system design interview, which most people flunk. So most people who are into Code Chef, 2-star, 3-star, 4-star हो गया. But then they flunk on the system design interview. Why? Because कभी ऊपर से system ही देखा नहीं. Okay, so I want to give you an overview of these things where jigsaw puzzles as in system design and all are very, very critical to understanding it. And the sooner you do this as a student, the better you can actually perform when in real life. So let's flash back to 1989. Huh? That seems like decades ago. Nobody was born in the room, right? Now, 1989 times, I'm writing my program, maybe first, second program. I'm forgetting C mein tha, GW basic mein tha. One of those two. Huh? Remember, 1989, Linux wasn't there. None of these things were there. So I'm creating a line. Kahin to I knew, I got to know that, hey, there's a line command. I was very interested in graphics. Okay, वो तो black and white monitor था, very, very pixelated, but फिर भी graphics मजा आता था. So then, how do I draw a line? Line, point A to point B, coordinates दिए, and line है. I wanted to animate the line. How many lines of code will you take to write a code that would animate a line? 2-3 lines. एक लाइन निकालो, then उसको गायब करो, and then loop करो. Like literally 3 lines, right? Literally I took 5 or about 100, 200 lines to write that. Line, gayab, line, gayab, line, gayab, line, gayab. You know why? I didn't know for loop. हाँ? कौन सिखाएगा for loop? कैसे पता लगेगा for loop? जरा सोचो. The only source of information back in 89 were computer magazines. PC World होता था, then PC Quest बना. One of the pages, there were 2 pages of code. You would die for those 2 pages of code. You would wait for that magazine every month. That's the only way you would learn. Then jump to 1994. Tehel ka ho gaya. There was the internet that actually came up, and there were student accounts given. So for 500 rupees, you could get for a year, 500 rupees for the entire year. Of course, 500 back then, probably 5,000 now. But for the entire year, you would get an internet account with a pretty unlimited access, but text only. Text only. So what did you use? Lynx browser. So in fact, just out of nostalgia, I have Lynx on my Linux system. I use Lynx. It's blazingly fast, I tell you. It doesn't matter wo internet 4G, 5G, kitna bhi G jao, internet remains slow. Why? Because sites have gotten heavy. But if you use Lynx and just do it with text, things are magical. But the thing that internet taught me at that point was the concept of openness, open access. The fact that I'm not begging for these things anymore. I'm not desperate for these things anymore. Search mar diya, aa gaya. Itna search bhi nahi tha. There was no Google back in 94. So it's Alta Vista and others. But there was Yahoo, which had categorized all this information. So you could go by categories and you would find these. But the biggest challenge here was, how do you find it? So one is, the main thing was, it was open source. There was access to these things. Nobody understood. I didn't understand open source kya hai, ye kya hai. It wasn't about source. It was just the fact that it's available. Papers were available. People were very generously putting out to-dos, how-to tutorials and so on. So there is this thing called Ubuntu. We know Ubuntu as an operating system. But Ubuntu is really a word in an African language called Bantu, which means humanity. It's the power of humanity coming alive. So the internet really got that up. Okay. Then slowly, I remember back in 2003-4, I was a product manager for LabVIEW at National Instruments in Austin. One of the things that we were building is a control system design software. We built very high-end control systems. So something that would go into a spacecraft or a plane and so on, but very, very high-end technically, but to be made very easy for engineers to actually program with it, scientists to use it. So one of the modules we were trying to create for LabVIEW was control system design. As a product manager for it, I was trying to figure out who else does something like that. And of course, MATLAB exists. How many of you have used MATLAB in college? Okay, most of you, right? So MATLAB still exists. It's been 20 years. How many of you use Julia? Please introduce your college to Julia. You're missing out. It's really powerful. It's like 10x fast and it's free. So, so now I found MATLAB, and guess what I found? GNU Octave. It's like a drop-in replacement for MATLAB. And guess what? I said, okay, it must be very expensive. It is free. So suddenly, for the first time, this thing hit. Open source matlab free. Unbelievable, right? Why would someone do that? But not just that. It was also modular. You had packages in GNU Octave. So you say, oh, they may not have this function. Bolne ke baad hai, and somebody will create that package for you. GNU Octave came out of University of Madison Chemical Engineering Department. They created something to teach chemistry, and then they just laid it out, but they designed it in that calculator way that I was talking. That calculator project, I really tell you, start one and really go deep. You may actually end up building chips. You may say, can I make it faster? Can I make it faster? And you may end up building chips. That's exactly what OpenAI is doing. Google is doing with Coral TPUs and all of that. They're kind of finally manufacturing chips to do that. So how deep can you go? So you have to architect it in a way that allows for these things to happen, which GNU Octave did. They had packages and so on, and it was amazing what happened after that. So this extensibility piece is very important when you're designing something. It's not just for you, it's for someone else to also come and contribute. Then back in 2009, I was at Google, but got invited to contribute to Aadhaar. So Aadhaar was formed out of volunteers initially, the initial specs and all of that. One of the interesting things about Aadhaar was it was very different in the way the problem statement was laid out. So Mr. Nilekani, who had given the problem statement, basically said, design everything in open source. And while I was into software at Google, we never really had open source, right? Within Google, yeah, there were pockets of open source, but not that big into it. And so designing something like Aadhaar with open source was the first time you hear something like that. And then you have geniuses like architect Dr. Pramod Verma and others, and a bunch of us trying to figure out what kind of software would scale. So it's simple MySQL, simple Pentaho, it's simple open source software that is actually powering Aadhaar today. All of these things are open source. And guess what? Aadhaar itself has an open source version called MOSIP, which is now being implemented by 10 plus countries. And so you see that power of actually what does open source mean in a no lock-in mechanism. So no restrictions, no lock-in. Why not from some company? Why not take something from Oracle, Microsoft, Google and build it? Tomorrow they own that roadmap. They break a function that you're using, you're dead. When it's open source, you have the right to fork it. Yeah, when it's a commercial product, you don't. And so this lock-in into a vendor, into something, and even further, if you think of sanctions and all, yeah, something happens and then all the countries say, oh, pull out of India. Then what? We can't use Aadhaar? How can you do that, right? How can you build national systems without actually locking into something? So it's a very important perspective to have when building software. So the whole India stack that has been built, all of the things that you see, even UPI and all, Now, whether they are open sourced in themselves or not, India is helping other countries do that, but they're all built on an open source stack. So it's completely indigenous in that sense. Now, thinking about also the scalability and configurability of Aadhaar. If you want others to also use it, it's one thing doing it yourself, but there's also a lot of refactoring required to actually make others use it. And so, for example, I think Sid gave that example, right, with his remotion related projects, how 5 contributors out of nowhere appeared and are contributing back to him. That means he has designed his code well. His code is contributable. So it's okay to make the smallest of things. It may be a 5-line code item, but if it's contributable, it's extensible, it's scalable, and it does something very well, people love it and people keep using it. Then going on to people, some of the people learnings that I've had, starting at Google. Google was a place where people were respected, revered, people were everything. I don't know the Google today, the whole layoffs business, that's different, very different than the Google that I remember. But the Google that I remember, we cared about people. So as a manager, if I'm managing people, and if something goes wrong, right, the person is not to blame. Let's say the person is not performing great, the person is not as productive. The first thing to look into is the manager, not the person. That powerful a concept to say everyone is an expert, everyone is a genius here. How do we bring the best out of them is the problem statement. So every one of you are super smart at what you do. It's just that you haven't found that repo, that little PR, that little thing that you take a path along that way. So you need to find that. Now, there were a lot of initiatives that Google used to run. So Google Summer of Code has been a very, very successful initiative. That's where I discovered, wow, there's so many open source projects. It's not just 1 or 2. Even that was a surprise to Google. When they actually put it out, there was a huge influx of these applications. So Google Summer of Code is an application process for builders. They reject them if they're not good enough. Very high quality repos there. So in fact, if you're looking for repos to contribute to, just look at Google Summer of Code repos from last 2 years. Contribute to anything. You'd get excellent, very high quality code to contribute to. Then there was Google Student Ambassador Program, which started in a very different way. It was more hands-on coding back then. Now it's morphed into a little more activity-based thing, but I think there is a slight balance there. But the most I remember is this one book. How many of you have read this book, Cathedral versus Bazaar? Okay, Mangesh has. So I would strongly recommend you read this. So this was a director, Brian Bouchard at Google, who recommended this strongly to me. He said, no, we were building something for managing the cloud, managing bunch of microservices and all. Kind of think of Puppet or Chef pre-Docker. So somewhere between Puppet, Chef and Docker, somewhere in between, we were building something like that. And he's like, you know what? There's probably a different way of thinking about it. Read this book and tell me what method would you like. And what Cathedral versus Bazaar does is it basically says, Cathedral is like building a big cathedral. Cathedral is a big church, right? Now building that requires top-down planning. Some architect has to say this is the way it's going to be. Okay, then everyone has to meticulously follow that and then build it, and something magical happens. Why? Because it's well planned. On the bazaar side, how does the bazaar work? One person puts up their stall, then another person comes next to him and puts up his stall. Is there a commonality in color? What is being sold? What is the pricing? It's just a bazaar. So that's the difference between a cathedral and a bazaar. Now when you're building a Aadhaar, it needs to launch, it needs to be deterministic, it needs to happen. And this is true for many of such projects where it's a national project, right? COVID. Right? COVID has to happen, right? So somebody has to guide it and make sure vaccine certificates actually hit, because that software is blocking people's lives being saved. You can't keep waiting for grounds up innovation to happen. And so there is a cathedral way of building it, which has its own place in itself. On the other side, there is a bazaar way of building it, which is build out small grounds up utilities. The entire Node.js, Express list of packages is a great example. That's a bazaar. The Frappe marketplace is a bazaar. Whole bunch of different things. Any kind of marketplace that you see, any kind of plugins that you see, those are grounds up. And it's self-selecting. People like it, they'll use it. They'll get more views, they'll get more stars, they'll be adopted. Those that don't work out, don't work out. Okay, so that's the difference between a cathedral and bazaar, and over my journey I've experienced both, and both have all their rightful place. So don't get into debates of, oh, why is that cathedral, why versus bazaar, I want to build it grounds up style versus this. वैसा नहीं होता. Both have their own place in it, but you need to be conscious about what would you like to do. For example, Frappe, I don't know how many of you have used Frappe. How many of you use Frappe? Frappe is a workflow engine, highly recommended. So Rishabh, look up community discussions, look up things. It's built very grounds up. It's not a cathedral, it's a bazaar mode of thinking, bazaar mode of crowdsourcing ideas, allowing people to chime in, taking its space to actually mature. But then what gets built is a very strong community around it. And that's a beautiful way, and Linux is no different. In that sense, Linux is also very much a bazaar way of actually growing. So there is a lot of learning, mentoring, humanity contributing to all of these things around open source when you think about people side of things. You may have this question in your mind here, I'm good at coding, but itna bhi maza nahi aata. How many of you, are borderline on that? Like, do you want to go deep into code and really contribute to your Kubernetes, or you want to do something different? So there are different functions also that you need to think about. And so if you suddenly like mentoring, right, you may actually be a great manager, a great engineering manager. You need to be able to figure out whom to help, how to get a whole community working towards you, and may not be an external community. Even if you have like 50 engineers in your team, that's a small community that you need to manage. It's a very different skill set to manage, motivate, drive 50 engineers than to actually drive it with, just by dictating something. Okay, so there is slight things that you would learn from yourself by participating in these different type of projects. Then there's this other element of crowdsourcing. How many of you know Google Maps was pretty much crowdsourced? And not just in India, most countries, Google Maps has been created by crowdsourcing. Now that's great, right? Even Google Traffic, for example, I remember launching back in 2012. All of these dots, how do you know it's red? Someone, you all and we all sending our Android dots to Google. And then we calculating, what is the speed, what are the things. So in that sense, we contribute something, we get back this image and we are happy. But there is a subtle thing happening here. It's not open. Do we have access to it? Do we know what's happening with it? No. So it's going into one company and then that's getting there. On the contrary, there is OpenStreetMaps, which is an open source version. But then doing these things becomes harder. These things require servers, require a lot of infrastructure to actually run that effectively in real time. The other perspective I want to give is around projects, so you need to carve out your own pathway. One of the things that we've done as Donio, starting 15, was kind of figure out project pathways for individual students. Anyone, right? Middle-aged professionals and others. And we've seen, if you know where you want to go, if you say, मुझे इसका कुछ नहीं आता, मुझे Kubernetes करना है, I think FACA laid out that plan for you, right? Go look around in groups, figure out what working group you want, introduce yourself, see what others are doing. That is a path. So no matter what, figure out a path for it. Okay, there is always a path to get to it. You got admission into engineering college? Yeah, you had a path, na? There was a JEE, then there was MHCET, there were all kinds of paths to get to that college. Similarly, there are paths to get to open source software. I think just figuring that out, this was one example where in 2018, I think, Shashwat was a brilliant guy in 11th grade, wanting to do quantum computing. Well, in 11th grade, quantum computing kahan se aa gaya? But We said, let's do machine learning and quantum computing. It was very ambitious in thought. We started with CS228. I don't know if you have ever seen that course, CS228 from Stanford. It's a probabilistic modeling course, Bayesian kind of a course, but gives you the basics really well. Starting with that, then started QSKit, then finally got accepted to QSF, which is the open source foundation for quantum computing. So you kind of grow through that path. That path needs to be laid out early. There's an experiment that we've been running where can you get these project-based things in your college itself? How many of you belong to an autonomous college? Many of you, right? Encourage your faculty to actually take up projects instead of actual syllabus. Kick out assessments that are multiple types. That was a COVID disease. We got rid of COVID, we didn't get rid of MCQs. So can you actually get into real world project based assessments? And happy to help if anyone wants to have a conversation, happy to talk to faculty and try to convince them to move that, because that's exactly what NEP is demanding. That's exactly the nature of NEP, practical hands-on experience. So a couple of colleges, we've been trying that, in PCCY we tried that and it worked brilliantly. Why? Because first time students said we learned something out of blockchain. Otherwise MCQ kya kare yaar, when was blockchain invented? That's not a question to answer, right? But implementing a blockchain, picking Ganache and actually running it on a laptop and making it work, all those things really give you the main thing. Now, a couple of years ago, we launched something called Code for GovTech at Samagra. So, Code for GovTech is like Google Summer of Code, but for the impact sector for population scale projects initiated in India. Now there are of course some of the international projects coming in. But this is where you can contribute to Ayushman Bharat Digital Health Mission, the consent manager, account aggregator, DigiLocker, Aadhaar, those kind of projects. And so just like you heard about Kubernetes thing or the Cloud Native Foundation mentorship, this is another mentorship thing to apply to. So I would highly encourage you to apply in case your college, there's a selection process for college chapters. But in case you have an active community, just approach, you can approach me on LinkedIn and I can connect you, but ensure that you could potentially run a college chapter in your college around Code for GovTech. So what does that mean? And you'd get training, you'd get a lot of support from, for example, Beacon. Anyone heard of Beacon? Anyone heard of ONDC? Yeah? Anyone heard of Nammayatri? All of that is based on Beacon as a protocol. Okay, so there is Nammayatri, ONDC, it's about how do you make people find each other dynamically. So you have only Amazon app and only Amazon seller and only Amazon delivery guy and only Amazon delivery. No? So how do you break that up? So how do you make a level playing field for everyone? That's ONDC. So anyone can have an app. Any examples of how that has been done before? UPI. Naito you would be stuck with only ICICI Bank app for only ICICI payment, right? Now you can use any bank's payment app for any bank's transfer to anyone from any bank. That's the beauty of democratizing these protocols. Now I'll quickly touch on jigsaw puzzles a little bit, and because it's a very important perspective to have. Whenever you're doing a project, one is a jigsaw puzzle of people and then of course jigsaw puzzle of technology. When you're thinking of jigsaw puzzle of people, I'll give you an example, one that we hit in one of the Indian states in Haryana. There were a lot of potholes. Government willing to fix those potholes, just don't know where the potholes are. So how do you do that? You say, okay, let's just launch an app. So geocoded pothole data coming back. But it's not that easy. When you have a photo taken of a pothole with a geocode, that pothole may be on a road that belongs to one of 8 different departments. It may be the National Highway Authority of India, it may be your local municipal corporation, it may be a society road, it may be agriculture board, the mandi roads are all owned by agriculture department. So suddenly you have to find kis department ko bheje, ye problem. Then you have to say, first of all, that mapping is a problem, right? You just sent a photo. You have to correlate it with the actual satellite photos, say where exactly is that, because GPS dot may be a little here and there. So where is that dot on a satellite photo, on a particular road marked, then correlate that with the MIS system. MIS system में क्या होगा? Is that road under warranty? Is that road going to be fixed next month anyway? So how do you know which thing to action on, right? So there is a huge MIS system, and then there is a satellite related system, right? Imagery system. How do you solve this? It's a jigsaw puzzle of people that you put. You only ask, let's say, NIC engineers, hey, can you do that? They're like, nahi, wo satellite ka nahi pata. So what did we do? Went to ISRO. Who better to know than satellite than ISRO, right? Within the government. Think about it, yaar. Government sends space shuttles to Mars. तो एक ऐप वैप नहीं बना सकते हैं? बना सकते हैं. It's just about piecing the right people together. So ISRO contributing to the maps part, NIC contributing to the MIS part, the state government helping, and all of that makes something like this come together. So why I'm telling you this story is because within colleges also you have the same thing. Each one of you opening up a documentation ticket on Kubernetes is not going to help. Can you actually complement your expertise? Some of you may like UX. Some of you may like program management. So community manager is a very hot hiring profile to be in today. We've been hunting for a community manager for Code for GovTech for a couple of months now. We've barely got one. Barely one. Huh? Multiple applications. We are always inundated with applications. Engineer hiring is like the toughest. We wait for four months before we can select one engineer. But now you say, यार job market नहीं है, job नहीं चाहिए, नहीं ऐसा नहीं है. Don't think there are no jobs. Huh? Jobs है. You need to be good enough. So what is good enough? Please ask and you will be told. But you need to work on it. So piecing together, finding what is your skill set and then complementing yourself to come up with something bigger in your college projects, highly encourage that. Then the other one is finding jigsaw puzzles in actual software. So this is an app that we created for village agricultural workers. Village agricultural workers have to go to different farms, collect some data, they have to coordinate themselves, do some scheduling and so on. तो उसका login होगा, what are the components needed, what are the building blocks in this Lego puzzle, jigsaw puzzle. तो Lego puzzle में क्या क्या होता है? Authentication होता है, then you would have some app monitoring, then you would have some data collection, then you would have some database, right? All of these have open source components. You need to be familiar with these. So if you say data collection, how many of you played with ODK, Open Data Kit? यार 10 साल पुराना project है, came out of a Google intern. Actually 20 years ago I think, 20 or at least 10. 10 million NGOs across the world who use Open Data Kit. Beautifully designed, very scalable. So you need to play around with these things. It's not good enough to know Java. वो ज़माना गया, 8 years Android experience, 3 years Java experience. That is, you're looking at service companies, which are not hiring anymore, by the way. So you really need to be problem solvers, not I know Java. So you need to have played with these things. ODK कभी install करके देखो, Frappe कभी install करके देखो, Fusion Auth कभी install करके देखो. How many of you have played with Fusion Auth for authentication? We all authenticate with Gmail, na? So we never even think authentication कैसे होगा. We can't rely on Google for everyday authentication. Then how do? You set up Fusion Auth. Now if you think about this village agricultural worker app has all these components, na? Authentication hai, data collection hai, ये सब है. Then in Uttar Pradesh, when we needed to create something that was actually doing oral reading fluency for students and automating assessments. तो कोई कुछ बोलता है बच्चा and all of that audio is recorded and you find out कि यार क्या बोला, is he recognizing the words correctly and then giving a score. So the assessment is done very quickly and in an unbiased way. This thing, if you think about it, other than the voice collection piece, voice recognition piece, everything else remains the same. It's a data collection app finally. You're collecting that data, all of the MIS is connected and so on. So the building blocks between these two things, other than the voice part, which we partnered with Google for on the voice recognition piece, but other than that, all of these building blocks are the same. वही PostgreSQL है, वही Open Data Kit है, वही Fusion Auth है. And so the goal is to figure out, when we figured that out, like, hey, this is a good jigsaw puzzle. एक आध component on off कर लो, you suddenly have 20 plus apps in 4 different states in 6 different domains, right? From skilling, agriculture, education, all of them use these 4-5 things. So sometimes it's about playing around and knowing 5-6 of these open source things really well, that you can then piece together solutions for others. Okay, so some of those, and then you will start creating those yourself. So in the AI world also, Kahani is the same. In the AI world, it is all a function of small models. So for example, let's say you wanted to create an AI model which is taking your prompt, your question, and trying to answer it. We launched this for, say, farmers in Odisha. Now there are various challenges there. When you give an agricultural term in Odia, it doesn't know it. No translation model is trained on that. फिर क्या करेंगे? Then you have to put some named entity recognition to extract that, replace it with the right one, do a spell check in Odia. ये सब कहाँ से आएगा, right? Spell check for brinjal in Odia in some dialect. This won't be there with GPT-4. So suddenly you have to take something for spell check, something for this, then you have to do something for asking more questions, more clarity. All of these are small models, building blocks. It's a jigsaw puzzle that we have to piece together to make something like AI also work. So my strong recommendation to you here is to really keep an eye out for what are these building blocks, and these building blocks are available to you. Take a look at Glyphic, take a look at Cord for blockchain, take a look at DEPA for consent management, take a look at, at Samagra we built a whole bunch of things around UCI, which is for communication interface, WhatsApp, SMS, anything. This powers, for example, the entire education systems runs on a software called Diksha. Diksha ka bhi bot hota hai, 200 million kids have access to it. It's all running powered by these components. And so one of the things about working on population scale projects, it's amazing when you actually see it being used at scale. So I'd highly encourage you to take a look at a whole bunch of Sunbird blocks. There is, by the way, a Sunbird conference next month, March 22nd, 23rd, I think, in Pune. So definitely attend it if you get a chance. How many of you have actually installed Frappe? Please do. It's a very powerful tool to actually get started. You can go to any NGO and say problem kya hai aapka software ka, and you can whip out a solution within half an hour. That is the power of Frappe. एक बार सीख लो. So there is, I think, Mangesh and others are trying this whole Linux installation thing. Okay, please participate in that. Get off Windows, get into Linux. So you're forced to kind of get into that mode. Then एक बार धक्का मार दिया, then हो जाता है. Then another one is, there are things like digit or population scale workflow systems, similar to Frappe, but highly scalable, highly configurable, and so on. So every time you're paying property tax in any city in India, you're probably hitting digit. तो कभी झांक के देखो, when you're hitting a UPI payment क्या हो रहा है पीछे, when you're doing Aadhaar authentication क्या हो रहा है पीछे. तो ऐसे करके एक करके you will come across a whole bunch of things. So that's the main thing I want to get you today with, is ensure you really understand what aspect of FOSS you like and double down on it. You say, yeah, it needs to be free in thought, it needs to be no lock-in, it needs to be grounds up. So think about what kind of projects exist like that and double down on that. Or then figure out how can you learn from people. I have learned more from people I have mentored than actually I have given them any knowledge. Okay? And lastly, there is this whole thing of jigsaw puzzles. Don't lose sight of the bigger picture and what are the blocks that go within it. Okay? So all the best with your journeys, and happy to guide you in any point. If you want to connect, just ping me on LinkedIn. Happy to share contact details and get connected. But don't let a question in your mind prevent you from action. Okay? We're all here to help. Thank you. I don't know if you have time for questions or anything, but maybe after the talk. I think we have one more session to go.
So we can include you in the panel.
Okay, sounds good. Karte hain.
Thank you, Rahul, for such a great session.